So some of the other techniques that I ended up using are, I'm going to focus really quickly on depth of field, and then I'll transition into the snowflakes. The snowflakes are actually just a bunch of spheres that are scattered throughout the environment. But it's enhanced by this depth of field effect. And the depth of field is basically providing focus on the subject matter, and everything else slowly falls out of focus, whether it's in the foreground or in the background of the subject. And so in order to demonstrate this, I'm just going to get rid of the mountain that I demonstrated in another demonstration, and I'll just create just a real simple scene of a couple of different pieces of geometry here. Okay, there we go. And just for the sake of the demo, I don't have to do this, but I think it'll provide a little bit of contrast here if I just throw some materials on here. And I'll also just throw a real simple ground plane into the scene, just again for contrast, so we can see this a little bit more clearly. There we go. That should be pretty good, and I'll just apply the white texture to that. Now what I want to do is I want to introduce a camera. This technique only works with the camera. Once I introduce a camera, I am not yet looking through the camera, and I'm just going to back off. Well, what you can see is that there's a plane of focus here, and if I go into the camera, there's a couple of different ways that I can control this. If I select the camera, or I select the center point on the camera, as I drag this center point of the frame or field of view here, you can see that I'm adjusting the focal distance of the camera. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to line this up with that middle sphere. Okay, now that camera is focused on this plane, and currently that plane is pretty much right on that center sphere. Now if I look through this camera, which by clicking on this little white bracket here has actually activated the camera, so I'm not looking through my perspective view at this point, I'm actually looking through this camera. If I give that a render, nothing happens. Nothing is blurry yet at this point. There's a couple of additional steps that I need to do in order to make this foreground background blur work. And if I go into the Details tab of the camera, so I got to have the camera selected, I'll go into Details, I can turn on Depth of Field Map Front Blur and Depth of Field Map Rear Blur. And in fact, to demonstrate this, I want to show you outside of the camera view. So I'm just going to click on that little camera bracket to deactivate that view. And if I turn on Depth of Field Front Blur, I'll turn that on, you can see that I get another plane of focus here. Okay? And basically what this plane does is this depth of focus right here on the camera, things start to transition to a full blur on the front blur plane. Okay, so anything that falls in front of that plane towards the camera starts to fall into blur. I can do the same thing with a rear blur. When I turn that on, you can see that I get the rear blur plane here, and I'll just kind of set that somewhere in between that last sphere and the middle sphere that I'm focused on. Now again, if I look through the camera and I give that a render, I still won't see any blur because there's one more step that I have to go through. So at this point, I introduced a camera, I set its focus to a point that I want to focus on, and then I've gone into the camera settings under Details and I've turned on the front and rear blur. I could just use one of them, but I'll demonstrate both of them. The final step that I need to go through is I need to go into Render Settings, and under Effects, I need to make sure that I turn on Depth of Field. That's a post effect. It happens after the render. First it'll render the scene and then it'll apply this blur. And so if I render this, I get a standard render at first, and then if I look down here in my status, it'll take a moment and then it will apply the depth of field. And once that's rendered, you can see it starting to blur the background now, and then it'll shift and start to blur the foreground. So it's completing that foreground blur render, and so the result that I get is that whatever the camera is focused on is completely in focus, and then it falls out of focus. So you can really control that and set that. So, but that is dependent on a couple of things. I have to be actually looking through the camera. The camera has to have under its details the depth of field, either front or back, turned on, and then in the render settings, I have to have the effect of depth of field turned on and make sure that it's active. I could also play around with these values here, but I think right out of the box that works just fine. Now, as far as the snowflakes go, I'm just going to get rid of a couple of these cubes. The technique that I used for the snowflake, there's a couple of them that we can use. We can use the same technique that we used for creating the trees. In other words, we could go under Tools, and then we could look through, let's see, Arrange Objects, and we can duplicate. Once we duplicate, I can make a whole bunch of duplicates. You know, for the sake of the demo, I'll make just about 45. I'll make sure that they're copies. In this case, I'll just make a circular duplicate, and I'll hit Apply. Once I create that, I can just kind of send these out along this radius here. And from there, what I should be able to go is back under that same menu. I can go to the Arrange Objects, and I can go to Randomize. Now, when I randomize, I can cause it to move in random directions according to, I'll just type in a couple of values here. I'll do 50. I'll leave the scale the same. The rotate is irrelevant, and I'll hit Apply. I don't know where they all went. Let's see. Let me hit the H key. Well, I had them all selected, so it appears that they moved them all at the same time. So let me just undo that. Now that should have scattered them. So what I'll do maybe is I'll increase the random seed, and I'll hit Apply, and I'm still getting the same results. Yeah, so I'm not sure, probably because I have the group selected and not the individual objects. So it's actually just randomizing this group that was made. So I suspect that if I select all of these individual objects here, and I go into Arrange Objects, Randomize, and I'll just do a new transformation. There we go. So the glitch there, the first time I tried to apply it, is that because whenever you select an object, in this case I have the sphere. Let me just make a new cube real quick. So if I have this cube selected, and I go to Tools, Arrange Object, and I duplicate, as soon as I duplicate this object, you'll notice that it generates an object group. That object group is full of all of the stuff that I just made. Okay? And by default, I had the object group selected, which is not what I wanted. I wanted the contents of that group selected. So now I have all of these cubes that I've made, and I can go back under Tools, Arrange Objects, and I can randomize them. Now, in the case of the cubes, just for kicks and just for the sake of the demo, I'll apply a 50% scale to these, and maybe I'll do like a 20-degree rotation in lots of different directions. But I will bring down this this move, and I'll just hit Transform. And so you can see that very quickly I can create this kind of randomization. So I just use randomization to generate a bunch of snowflakes in the environment, because alternatively what I would have had to have done is, make one sphere. I could duplicate it, but then I'm stuck kind of moving these things around, and I probably had 100 little spheres here. And I did simplify those as well. So because I'm generating a lot of objects in the scene, when I started with my sphere, because they were going to be small, I took the segmentation down probably by half. So I'm generating half of the geometry that I would have been had I just left those as their standard. Now there is one other way that's actually much more powerful in order to do this, and that is by using the MoGraph component. And so MoGraph is this really great module built into the Cinema 4D Studio version, and you can find it by going to this MoGraph pull-down menu. And the idea is that you can grab this cloner object. Once you have the cloner object, the idea is that you drag and drop a sphere into the cloner, and you can see that it already started to clone this object. And if I select the cloner, in some ways it's very much like duplicate, but I have a couple of more options, and this is basically non-destructive. So I can, unlike the duplicate function, the cloner is an object, it's not a function, so I can deselect it and I can go back to it. And in fact, I can animate it over time, but that's a little outside the scope of this project. So in this case, I just created a cloner, I threw a sphere into it, and with that cloner selected, I set it to grid mode. And you can see now it's building a grid. And I'll just make this grid a little bit bigger so we can see it a little bit more clearly. I'll make it like 1,000 pixels by 1,000, or excuse me, centimeters. So I have this grid, and as I bump up the grid count, I can just generate more and more stuff here. So got a few too many zeros on this here. So let me just take some of these down. There we go. Okay, so I just made this huge grid of spheres. Now, if I want these to be, snowflakes, Obviously, I'd want to play with the size and the scale, but there's this other object here that if I have the cloner selected and I go back into MoGraph, I should be able to go in here, go under effectors, and I'm looking for a random effector. Now, once I apply a random effector, because I had that cloner selected, if I go into the randomness here, I can really adjust lots of different values being randomized. And I'll focus on the transform field here. And if I just bump up the position change, so it's randomizing the position based on these numbers, and I'll just type in 100, let's see, maybe I'll make that 1,000 centimeters by 1,000 centimeters by 1,000 centimeters. So I have a really kind of dense field of snow here, but again, if I keep spreading this out, or if I play back and forth between the cloner object and the size I have here, I'll just bump that up to 5,000, and very quickly you can see that I can generate a swarm of objects in this space. So these are just a really a couple of different techniques that we can use, and I combined that with the camera depth of field, and I got some pretty interesting results with that. So, and I have a few more techniques that I'll share with you, and I'll keep throwing those in the tips and tricks.